War with Iran can hit a tipping point in just a few hours. A U.S. official has confirmed to CBS News the U.S. has conducted strikes on military targets on Kharg Island overnight. And this comes as President Trump ramps up threats against Iran ahead of the 8 p.m. Eastern deadline to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. In a new Truth Social post, the president says in part, quote, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again." He went on to say, quote, "Maybe something revolutionary, wonderful can happen." Let's bring in CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes. Look, I think this is the question we're all asking. How serious is this threat? Have you heard from the White House since that post?
We have not heard from White House officials trying to walk this back in any way. Look, we're used to hyperbole from this president. We're used to threatening rhetoric, but this definitely takes it up a notch. His language here is almost apocalyptic when he says that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. Clearly, what he's trying to do in plain terms is to put pressure on the Iranians, try to force them to cut a deal before the deadline he has put in place for 8 o'clock Eastern time tonight. He was already ramping up the rhetoric yesterday, laying out that he was going to start bombing at midnight, power plants, bridges, insisting that he really means it this time. He has walked back threats like this with a deadline before. In this case, he is not walking it back. If anything, he is getting more specific and he is getting more aggressive.
So, Nancy, have we at all heard from the Iranians in the face and in the wake of this new, and to use your words, apocalyptic threat?
We have heard from the Iranians, not in the face of this latest threat, but certainly overnight. We heard from the Iranian president, who posted on X that there are 14 million Iranians who are willing to sacrifice for their country, and he is one of them. So you've got tough talk coming in the other direction as well, even as President Trump acknowledges that he thinks that negotiations are going okay, that he thinks that the Iranians are negotiating in good faith. And the vice president, J.D. Vance, who's traveling abroad in Hungary, just said in a press conference this morning that this is just President Trump using the leverage he has to force the Iranians to cut a deal and reopen the strait. He said that this war is almost over, and the question is just whether it's going to essentially end the easy way for the Iranians, where they make a deal, where they re-enter international society and improve their economy, or whether they hold out and continue to fund terrorists and see their economy and their infrastructure crumble even more. So it's definitely a day where both countries are on edge. The Iranians have been saying that they're going to have citizens form human chains around power plants as we get closer to that 8 p.m. Eastern deadline. And there's a real sense, both here and abroad, that no one is quite sure how this day is going to end up.
So, Nancy, I guess my question then would be, just objectively speaking, if we take a step back and see where we are today with the President of the United States threatening to wipe out a civilization, that the analysis that was done sort of earlier in the wake of the start of this war was that the White House, did not perhaps believe that they would be at this point, that they would have to threaten to wipe out an entire civilization over the belligerence of Iran, because they perhaps thought that they would have this wrapped up based off of, like, I guess, either intelligence or their earlier success with Venezuela.
Well, part of the challenge is that the president's goals have shifted and continue to shift right up until current day. Keep in mind, it was just last week that he said that the Strait of Hormuz would open up naturally once the war was over. Now he's insisting that Iran open it right now, allow oil tankers to make their way safely through the strait, or he's going to bomb all of their power plants and their infrastructure. He has also, at some points, indicated that he might be willing to send in ground troops in order to get Iranian stores of uranium, because it is very important to him that they not have the ability to build a nuclear bomb in the future. Now he's telling reporters, including our own Weijia Jiang, that he doesn't need to do that, that he can simply monitor what the Iranians are doing using satellite technology, human intelligence, because that uranium is buried so deep that the Iranians can't get to it anyway. So the goals at certain points have shifted, and that makes it very difficult to assess what exactly would have to happen in order for this administration to believe that it has reached its goals and to wrap up this war and go home.
And Nancy, finally, have we heard from White House officials who are concerned perhaps about the aftermath of this, if the president does follow through with his threat, what this sort of means internationally for our allies, our partners, because there are some who have suggested that what the president is threatening to do would constitute a war crime. So what position does that leave the United States in if this comes to fruition? And is anybody at the White House talking about that?
We've certainly heard Democrats voicing that concern, Vlad. And in fact, they even previewed the possibility that something like this might happen. You'll recall there were those 6 Democrats, 6 lawmakers who had served in intelligence or in the military, who made that video basically telling members of the military that if you get an illegal order, if you get an order, for example, that you think constitutes war crimes, you don't have to follow it. That is the law. And that really upset the White House and the president. They even went after one of those Democrats, Mark Kelly, a senator from Arizona, and stripped him of his rank. He's under investigation by the Pentagon because of it. And so you now have Democrats saying that they're very worried that the president will go too far. And certainly you've had international law experts and leaders abroad saying the same thing. But as for people voicing those kinds of concerns here at the White House right now, they're still behind him.
All right, Nancy Cordes, appreciate it. For more on the situation in the Middle East, we turn now to CBS News foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer, who's in Tel Aviv. So we mentioned, Liz, the strikes on Kharg Island. What more do we know about those that the U.S. conducted?
Well, the strikes on Kharg Island were on military targets, not on the oil installation itself, which suggests that the U.S. wants to leave it intact because it's a huge revenue raiser. And after this war is over, Iran is going to need money from oil to rebuild itself, or whoever's in charge will need money to rebuild. We've also seen the Israelis starting to take out trains and train bridges today. There was a message that went to social media in Iran yesterday from Israel in Farsi saying, we advise Iranians to stay away from trains and rail infrastructure until 9 o'clock tonight. And indeed today we have seen strikes on railway bridges and tracks, not clear how many. And of course there's been other targeting too, things that we've seen in the past days as well. Airports where the Revolutionary Guard is dug in, an aerospace center in Tehran, that sort of thing.
So as the president's deadline approaches, Liz, are we hearing at all from the Iranians?
Well, nothing clear, which has kind of been their method all along. An Iranian official spoke to the Reuters news agency, and he said Pakistan is continuing to convey messages, which implies that there's back and forth. But he said the U.S. hasn't changed its tone as far as Iran is concerned. There are no what he'd call negotiations, and that Iran is simply not going to reopen the Straits of Hormuz in return for what he called empty promises. So it's not, if going by that, is really not sounding very optimistic. He ended with what also sounded like a very aggressive threat. He said, if Iran's power network is targeted, that will plunge Saudi Arabia and the Gulf into darkness. In other words, that Iran would then turn its missiles on the Gulf's electricity infrastructure, and everybody would suffer. So high stakes. But there's been so much shadow play in this whole affair, and I think it's safe to say we just don't know what is going on at the negotiating table right now. It does seem as if there is some back and forth. What it will yield and whether it will bring us closure before 8 o'clock tonight, we're just going to have to be patient.
Yeah, indeed. All right, Elizabeth Palmer for us in Tel Aviv. Thank you, Liz.